may not have heard of a lady named Fanny Crosby, but you've probably sung one of her hymns if you've grown up in the church. She wrote Blessed Assurance and Rescue the Perishing and To God Be the Glory, and those were just three. She wrote over 9,000 hymns over the course of her career, which didn't begin until she was 24, and her career lasted for 70 years. She was 94 when she wrote her last hymn. She died in 1915, so it was a long time ago. But her songs were immediately embraced by the church of her day. They were featured at the Moody and Shankly revivals, which were sort of the Billy Graham revivals of her day. Her music was, for her generation, very contemporary. She was writing, and the church was immediately using them, and it was a wave of new music in the church that she was bringing in. Her music was, for her generation, something that drew them closer to the Lord like they hadn't had before. But some of the publishers were a little bit hesitant to put too many of her songs in the same book or the same pamphlet that they were publishing and distributing to churches for a cost, of course. They just like, well, we don't know how people are going to react if all of them are written by the same person. And so they came to Fanny Crosby, which was also a pseudonym, so to speak, if she would publish some of them under a different name. And she's like, sure, I'll publish them under a different name. This request came so much that she published songs under 200 different names. And as a result, she's not only influenced her own generation, but many more to come. Some of those hymnals had a lot of different authors. Fanny Crosby. She was an astounding lady. When describing her method of writing a hymn, she said, well, it may seem a little old-fashioned always to begin one's work with prayer, but I never undertake a hymn without first asking the good Lord to be my inspiration. She was always, though, at heart, a follower of Jesus who felt compassion for those who needed assistance. When she received her first check, and it wasn't for writing for hymns, it was for writing a book of poems, she had them published, and that first check she said, I want to take this, and I want to open my hand wide to those who need assistance. Later on, she and her husband would organize concerts. And half of the proceedings that she got from it, they would give to the poor. You might not know it, but she not only wrote all those hymns, but she had a beautiful voice, and so she did concerts, and she was an engaging speaker. And there were always people who wanted her to be at their gatherings to do those things. When she finally got old, which she considered when she turned 60, she decided that she wanted to be known for more than just someone who wrote hymns. And so she committed her life to rescue missions. She'd been involved with them her whole life, but she really poured herself into them. She would sing songs at these missions. She would go to the prisons or any gathering that was going to benefit the poor in Jesus' name. She wanted to help them do that. She wanted to be known as Jesus wants us to be known, by our love. But what most people don't know about Fanny Crosby is that she contracted a virus when she was 6 weeks old, which left her blind. She did all this physically blind for her entire life. And it seems that while she was physically blind, just from what we know about her, she was never spiritually blind, which is a much more common problem in the church. It was not Fanny Crosby, but a hymn by Clara Scott that first introduced to me the idea that you could be spiritually blind. The first verse of her hymn went, "Open my eyes that I may see glimpses of truth thou hast for me. Place in my hands the wonderful key that shall unclasp and set me free. Silently now I wait for thee. Ready, my God, thy will to see. Open my eyes, illumine me, Spirit divine." I was pretty young at the time that I heard that hymn. I had just started attending church, so I was trying to figure out everything that was going on. And I'll be honest, we sang that song, and I had no idea what it was really talking about. But I liked the idea of getting a glimpse of truth. I didn't realize at the time that Jesus often said, after speaking to a crowd in parables, let him who has ears to hear and eyes to see understand. Some did, but evidently a lot didn't. But what made Jesus and his message be clear is he was essentially saying with that phrase, if you can't grasp the truth that I am revealing, then you are spiritually blind. Even those who understood what Jesus said but refused to accept it, he considered spiritually blind. And he wasn't afraid of naming names of those who are spiritually blind. Can you imagine if I were to stand up here and say, okay, you're spiritually blind. You may not come next week, right? And I would be a little cautious about doing that. I did point at myself first at different times. But Jesus was confrontational. He often told the religious leaders who were in those crowds that came to hear him that they were unmistakably spiritually blind. And as you might guess, they were a little infuriated by it. In chapter 9, the chapter before our text comes from, we're told the story of when Jesus restored the physical sight to a blind man, giving credence to his claim that he had come from God. At the end of that chapter, in verses 35 through 41, Jesus asked that the no longer blind man whom he had healed, do you believe in the Son of Man? And the no longer blind man said, who is he, Lord, that I may believe in him? And Jesus answered, you have both seen him, and he is the one who is talking with you. And the man responded, Lord, I believe. And he began to worship Jesus right there. That's in John 9, 35 to 41. Jesus then proclaimed to those who were standing around and watching, for judgment I came into the world so that those who do not see may see, and those who see may become blind. And the Pharisees asked him, because they were in that crowd, we're not blind too, are we? To which Jesus answered honestly, if you were blind, you would have no sin. But since you say we see, your sin remains. I asked the artificial intelligent internet search engine on my computer, what causes spiritual blindness? I was just curious what it was going to say. And it really gave me a pretty good answer. I was really surprised. It said that there could be various factors, and I'm going to give you the 9 that it provided me. It said, well, one of the ways you can become spiritually blind is with sin. Missing the mark of God's commands. It clouds a person's spiritual vision, making it difficult to see God's truth, especially in regard to your own sin. Pride. Some people are too proud to acknowledge their need for God or to accept spiritual truths about Him or about themselves. Ignorance. A lack of knowledge about spiritual matters can lead to spiritual blindness. Kind of like the blind man who gets his sight. He didn't know who Jesus was. He was ignorant of that. Cultural and societal influences. The beliefs and perspectives of your society can be shaped by the culture and the society. It leads to spiritual blindness. Personal trauma and conditioning. Past emotional pain or trauma can affect a person's spiritual perceptions. Materialism. An overemphasis on material goals and external achievements can distract from spiritual awareness. A resistance to self-analysis. Avoiding introspection can prevent individuals from recognizing their own spiritual needs. Over-reliance on religious organizations. Strict legalistic adherence to dogmatic beliefs can lead to spiritual blindness, like the Pharisees. Fear and resistance to change. Fear can inhibit a person's ability to embrace spiritual growth and change. Not a bad list for a computer. And it concluded by saying, overcoming spiritual blindness involves a personal journey of self-discovery, reflection, and a willingness to open one's heart to spiritual truth. After Jesus restored the blind man's physical sight, he clearly reveals his identity to him, providing him with the opportunity to gain that spiritual sight. And just as I read a moment ago, this now seeing man physically began to see spiritually. He took that opportunity, he recognized who Jesus was, and he began to worship him. The central idea of chapter 10, from which our text comes from, is spiritual blindness prevents people from understanding that Jesus came to lead them into an abundant life, like a good shepherd does for his sheep. Now, you think that this would be a pretty easy truth to get across, that people could grasp this one without too much trouble? But many didn't see it back then, and a lot of people still don't see it today. As I mentioned, the religious leaders of the Pharisaic persuasion were not convinced by what Jesus had done or what he had said. And of course, they were spiritually blind, so they didn't see their own sin or their need for a Savior to be sent to them from God, which is why they postulated that the reason Jesus could do these extraordinary things was because, if he had really done them, was because, yeah, he was empowered by a demon. That's how he got that power. They also discounted Jesus' teachings as the ravings of a madman. I mean, he's just talking crazy over there. They simply couldn't comprehend how anyone would ever consider reasonable anything that Jesus said. But there were others in the crowd who were beginning to open their spiritual eyes to the truth as Jesus revealed it to them. They figured that only a person from God could really restore the physical sight to a blind man. And they also understood that demons were not in the business of using their powers to help people out. So they had some spiritual vision, but it was still sort of cloudy vision. It wasn't clear vision yet. It's to this very mixed up crowd that Jesus shares the parable that begins in chapter 10. Well, actually, John didn't call it a parable. He called it a paromia. A parable, parabole, which means to cast along the side of, was their word for an illustration. If you were a teacher and you made a point, then you would parabole. You would throw something alongside of it to illustrate your point so people could understand it. Jesus was often giving parables. He would say things like, the kingdom of heaven is like. And then he would tell a story of what it was like. But he didn't always explain what those stories really meant. He left it up to the crowd to figure out his points. And his disciples were always saying things like, hey, Jesus, how come you're always speaking in parables? Their question is, when are you going to make the point, Jesus? You just keep telling them a story and a story and a story and a story. And it's great to read stories. I don't know if you know this, but there are books for preachers that are called sermon illustration books, and they're just story after story after story. They're great fun to read, but they would be kind of meaningless if you didn't know the point. Preachers turn to them like, here's my point, here's the story I'm going to use, and make it up. But Jesus would often tell the stories without making the point. And he would say, if they have spiritual eyes, if they have spiritual ears, then they will hear the right point. And his disciples were like, just be like everyone else, Jesus. Just give them the point. Make it clear. Tell the story. You're making this more difficult than it should be. Fortunately, there are those places where Jesus spent time to explain to his disciples in great detail what one of his parables meant. And that gives us some idea of how to interpret the ones that he didn't give us for. But paramia meant the same along the side of. And it was not used to illustrate a point. It was used to talk about how a story revealed what was happening in a situation. What was unfolding in society or would unfold. A Pharisee is going, let me tell you the story, and it'll explain what's taking place here. And so that's what's being done here. Jesus' story reveals why the crowd is beginning to see in Jesus a shepherd who is sent from God, and why their religious leaders didn't have their best interest in mind. Jesus told them this paramia, John 10, 1 through 5. Truly, truly, I say to you, he who does not enter by the door into the fold of the sheep, but climbs up some other way, he is a thief and a robber. But he who enters by the door is a shepherd of the sheep. To him the doorkeeper opens, and the sheep hear his voice, and he calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he puts forth all his own, he goes ahead of them, and the sheep follow him because they know his voice. The stranger they simply will not follow, but will flee from him because they do not know the truth. John tells us immediately after that those in the crowd heard this story and they didn't understand it, not spiritually speaking. Can you imagine being the shepherd? Who's the door? What's going on here? I don't quite understand it. I'm wanting to get a glimpse of truth, but it's just not coming. John tells us that Jesus then begins to help them understand this paramia by giving them a few more details. He stated very plainly in verses 7 through 10, which we read earlier today in our service, that he was the door. He said, you're trying to figure that story out? I'm the door. And all the sheep who enter through me will be saved. They would need to recognize him as their shepherd and follow him so that they could find pasture as well. And in other words, they would need to go through a similar experience as that no longer blind man had to go through. That is, they would have to open their eyes and see a title taken from Ezekiel's prophecies. I don't know if you know this, but Ezekiel used the title Son of Man 93 times in his book. I mean, if you want to know what Son of Man means, that's the place to go to it. It's a reference to what Daniel would say. He only used it a couple of times, but it's Daniel we tend to think of because he used the term Son of Man to talk about the one who would come in the clouds like the Son of Man. They would have to believe that Jesus was that Son of Man, that one that God had sent to save them. That he was who he claimed to be, and he could do what he said he would do. It is then that they, like this no longer blind man, could worship Jesus. We have to be converted. We have to come to know him as Savior so that we can worship him. And I was talking about this in the Sunday school class. The word for worship there is proskuneo. It's the word that shows up everywhere else in the Bible. Pros toward, kuneo, to kiss. And I kind of like that this man is standing before Jesus and he just starts toward Jesus with affection and love. That's what worship is. And for that to happen, they would also have to flee from the lies about Jesus that the Pharisees were spreading. Of course, there were some Pharisees who would also open their eyes, like Nicodemus, but most of them didn't. Most of the Pharisees kept them closed. That's why Jesus told them that they would have to think, the crowd, they would have to think of the spiritually blind Pharisees as these rustlers, these thieves and these robbers who came only to steal and kill and destroy the sheep. And they would have to think of him, Jesus, as the one who came to give them life. And it could be life abundantly as in super life, or it could be that he just abundantly gave life everywhere he went, all over the place, and to anybody who needed it. The part of the story that we often focus on is Jesus identifying himself as the Good Shepherd. In fact, some people read through the whole chapter of 9 and 10s together, and they're like, oh yeah, Jesus the Good Shepherd. I grasp that. That's what I get. We didn't read that part of this chapter earlier, but I want us to do it now together. It's found in John 10, 11 through 18. And so I want you to be listening in it for aspects of spiritual blindness and aspects of spiritual sight. I am the Good Shepherd. The Good Shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. He who is a hired hand and not a shepherd, who is not the owner of the sheep, sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and flees, and the wolf snatches them and scatters them. He flees because he's a hired hand and is not concerned about the sheep. I am the good shepherd, and I know my own, and my own know me. Even as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. I have other sheep which are not of this fold. I must bring them also, and they will hear my voice, and they will become one flock with one shepherd. For this reason the Father loves me, because I lay down my life so that I may take it again. No one has taken it away from me, but I lay it down on my own initiative. I have authority to lay it down, and I have authority to take it up again. This commandment I received from my Father. To me, Jesus makes it pretty clear that he cares for the people that he was speaking to, regardless of their state of spiritual blindness or sight. And he was willing to lay down his life for them. I'm sure you've noticed that Jesus repeated himself a few times about that aspect of his love. I lay down my life. He mentions it 3 times in this section. It seems to be a pretty important aspect of his love for us. Of course, we know the rest of the story, so we know how and when Jesus would lay down his life. It would be upon the cross of Calvary. It would be a sacrifice for sin once and for all for the whole world. And in doing so, Jesus, the Good Shepherd, became Jesus, the Lamb of God. He became the sheep, taking our place so that we could be forgiven. He took up his life again, rising from the dead on the 3rd day, conquering death, which is the punishment of sin, and extending to us the forgiveness that he secured as the sheep who's led to the slaughter. He's both the sheep and the shepherd. Jesus also made it clear that he was just not like a hired guy, right? That stood out to me when I read through it. Those people who ultimately aren't concerned for the people around them. Unfortunately, there have been a lot of people who say they follow God and say that they're shepherds, but when push comes to shove, they're really just in it for themselves and not for those that they serve. Jesus would defend and care and provide what the sheep need despite the cost. I feel like, or I should say I do like, that John reminds us that this is why Jesus said, my Father loves me. He did what the Father sent him to do. He expressed God's love to the world. Jesus went on to say that he was looking forward to that day when all of the sheep, even those from another fold, would comprise one flock and follow him, their one shepherd. You can just imagine how many people have been given strange interpretations to what that other flock is. It's pretty simple. He was speaking to Judeans. He was in that context. He was talking to people who were Jewish. They were going to be a part of it. And then the other flock was going to be people who were not Jewish and coming to him. They would hear the truth, and they would become his disciples, and they would become one flock following the one shepherd. There's only one Jesus, and you're either following him or you're not. It's one of the things I like about our tradition. People will say, well, what church do you belong to? And there's a party that says, well, the one Jesus established. Either you're following Jesus or you're not. You're either a part of his church or you're not. But we like to get it all divided up, which is the opposite of what Jesus prayed for. He says, man, he prays that his church be one so that the world would believe. Can you imagine the witness to the world that we could give if everyone who followed Jesus were the one church, and we acknowledged one another, and we supported one another, and we encouraged one another, rather than fighting one another? The eyes of those from the Pharisaic persuasion were not open even a little bit. But the eyes of some of the crowd were beginning to open up. They were starting to see that there was much more to Jesus than they previously understood. However, Jesus was for them, for the most part, still sort of a mystery. They didn't quite fully get who he was, but Jesus would keep revealing himself over his ministry. He would do what he said in advance, and they would come to recognize him. In verses 19 through 21 of this chapter, we're told that Jesus said, what Jesus said on that day created a division among those who were listening to him. You know, Jesus said, I didn't come to bring peace, but a sword. I came to divide. He's got this crowd in front of him. And for someone who's speaking, it's like, man, you speak to the crowd. Everybody just responds the same way. And Jesus says, no, I told them this parable, and it split them. I mean, if we're going into a political year, and it seems like everything's divided, right? Man, the crowd that Jesus was speaking to got really divided real fast. There were those who were saying, in these words, he has a demon and he's insane. Why do you listen to him? And others were saying, these aren't the sayings of a demon-possessed man. A demon can't open the eyes of the blind, can he? I mentioned that earlier. I'm repeating it again. The truth about Jesus is divisive. Because those who are spiritually blind will fight against it, tooth and nail. They'll come up with every reason why Jesus is a fairy tale, or Jesus doesn't make any sense, or he's just a weird person, or it's just history, or they'll come up with all kinds of stuff. They'll say, look at the church, look at his followers. I mean, those are hypocritic people. I mean, they say they follow Jesus, they don't look like. They'll just come up with all kinds of stuff. But those who are beginning to open their eyes will see in Jesus a Savior who forgives them of their sin, who transforms their life, and who truly does bring an abundance into it by all the blessings that he has, and we embrace it and we defend it. I am going to ask the music team to go ahead and start making their way up as we come to a close. I'm just going to suggest what Jesus said. You're on one side or the other. You're either spiritually blind or you can spiritually see. There's not grayscale in here. You either do or you don't. And as I said earlier, there are many causes for spiritual blindness. And I might say that sometimes we just get bad vision for a while. It prevents us from recognizing that we're the sheep in the story. If you're supposed to be identifying with someone in the story, it's the sheep. We are the ones who need a safe haven. We're the ones who need his care and his provision. We're the ones who need a door to pass through because we can't get out any other way. We need a good shepherd who's going to come to us and lead us to the right place. There's so many people trying to get to us. We need protection from those who want to devour us and who want to lead us astray and want to get us off track from the truth. We need someone who's willing to lay down their life for us that we might live. And we're not alone. There are a lot of people who need this. There are a lot of sheep, but there are only one shepherd. If you're spiritually blind, it's my prayer that your eyes be opened or start to open so that you can see Jesus and all that he's offering you. And if you can see, spiritually speaking, may you keep your eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, as you follow the Good Shepherd. And in doing so, may you reveal his truth to those who need to see it. To share it with those who are spiritually blind. Because spiritual blindness can be healed with his truth. Would you please